Hi, good afternoon. I'm Ramanathan, a professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Our director, Tony Heyman, is not here, so I'm going to be Mr. Heyman for 5 minutes. It's really my great pleasure and distinct honor to welcome all of you to the land of Roger Revelle, David Keeling, and Walter Monk. You know, each of them have made singular contributions to our understanding of the planet. And this campus is also really proud, Scripps and UCSD, that you have chosen to honor one of us, Dr. Louis Branscombe, and also dedicate an entire forum to the sorts of topics and issues he has worked on. I myself had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Branscombe only recently, a month ago, or in a dinner. I know that reading the materials, I've not been involved with the UCS, and now I would be, is that you're focused on really enhancing the role of science in going after fundamental problems facing society. And it is just so timely. I want to give you an example and why I personally feel in tune with what you're all about. It was February 16th of this year, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced a major sort of attack on climate change. She formed a coalition called Climate and Clean Air Coalition, teaming up with 6 countries and United Nations. They were basically going after 4 pollutants, which are contributing as much as 40% to the global warming. The other 60% is carbon dioxide, which we need to do something, but we don't know what to do as so far. So this 40% of the climate pollutants, the beauty of them is that we have technologies to cut them drastically. Just California, I am happy to say it in front of our CAR board chairperson, that California has cut one of these major pollutants by 50% in just last 20 years. And this can be replicated worldwide. In so doing, the estimate is almost we can slow down global warming of the coming decades by about 50%, half of it, and slow down some of the melting sea ice and glaciers. But the real reason it caught on is that by cutting down air pollution, you save about 2 million lives every year, and also save about 100 million tons of crop damages due to air pollution. So it's sort of a win-win, and the countries see this, they see something they can do now, and the effects will be seen tomorrow. Tomorrow here is a year to 10 years. That's why they're called short-lived. They go out of the atmosphere as soon as you get rid of their emissions. Anyway, why am I talking about this here? I was invited to that event because UCSD, Scripps, and several departments has made major contribution to this. And that night, Todd Stern, her Hillary Clinton's chief negotiator, she personally came and gave a beautiful talk without any notes on short-lived climate pollutants. I wish I could learn that from her. And Todd Stern, I was sitting next to him. It was a round of we did dinner at the Georgetown restaurant, and he opened the dinner, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here because the State Department read a paper written by Dr. Ramanathan in 2009. So I was thinking, which paper? Is it Journal of Geophysical Research? I written a paper in Proceedings. I fell off my chair when he said, this was a paper in Foreign Affairs. It turns out I was writing papers on this, got frustrated, and then teamed up with a social scientist in our School for International Relations and Pacific Studies, Jessica Wallach. She now is in India heading up an NGO. What I learned from that experience is that as scientists, we all dig trenches. We love digging trenches. Occasionally we find a pearl, if you're lucky, a gold nugget. But I think the real reward I found is for us to come outside our trench, see somebody in the neighboring trench and work with them. We explored the policy implication of what I've been doing for the last 30, 40 years. Of course, many groups have contributed to this short-lived climate pollutant. So I'm really hoping that this sort of forum would really catalyze such things happening. We need that. Physical scientists and social scientists working across their own trenches. I just want to conclude one more example, just to brag about UCSD. Four of us, Naomi Oriskus, she's here, David Victor, again a political scientist, Charlie Kennelly, somewhere in the audience, and myself. We just finished a course, unlike any course that's been taught, on climate change, on the political, social, and scientific dimensions of it, drawing students from across the campus. So, with Dr. Branscom's forum, I hope this kind of a thing would explode. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramanathan, and thank you all for being with us this afternoon. I'm Kevin Knobloch, the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists. We have a wonderful program over the next 2 hours, including remarks from Lou Branscom and an exciting panel discussion moderated by Casey Cole, featuring some very distinguished guests, David Baltimore, Naomi Oreskes, Mary Nichols, and John Porter. You will also hear from Jim McCarthy, who is the chair of the UCS board and the Agassiz Professor of Biological Oceanography at Harvard, as well as Peter Frumhoff, who is the Director of Science and Policy at UCS, later in the program. So thank you to the speakers. Thank you to the members of our very distinguished host committee for helping us introduce the new Center for Science and Democracy. I am delighted to tell you about our plans, and to do so in such a storied institution. Scripps, as Ram has noted, has been such a powerful leader in both scientific research and in providing our democracy with the vital information we need to address some of our greatest challenges. This linkage of research to governance exemplifies the best of a long-standing tradition in America. And it's a point that is central to the mission of our new enterprise. In fact, science and democracy were forged together at our nation's beginning. We are all familiar with the iconic image of Benjamin Franklin experimenting with electricity in a lightning storm, although this is, I think, one of the most manly portraits I've seen of Benjamin Franklin. Yet, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, and George Washington were all avid students of the natural and physical worlds. Their love of and respect for science influenced the development of our nation's governing architecture. Our patent system, established to promote science and the useful arts, was written into the very first article of the U.S. Constitution. Abraham Lincoln would later say that the patent system added fuel of interest to the fire of genius. Adams spoke of the science of government, and in a debate with Benjamin Franklin in 1776, he used the principle of mechanical equilibrium to argue on behalf of his conception of our new system's checks and balances. Jefferson wrote of the value of science to a Republican people, noting the security it gives our liberty and how it enlightens the minds of its citizens. From our nation's inception, then, our greatest leaders have equated the pursuit of scientific knowledge with the pursuit of liberty, and freedom from oppression with freedom of inquiry. And this great American relationship of science and democracy has delivered, bearing a prolific and steady stream of benefits in health, welfare, security, and prosperity to Americans and people around the world. One essential and perhaps underappreciated aspect of this dynamic relationship is that the private sector has proven to be as vital a partner to science as has government. Our national respect for science has nurtured an intimate alliance between well-supported free inquiry in the public sphere and the development of life-saving and life-altering technologies and products in private enterprise. The public investments and private ingenuity found in the medical research and drug development sectors, for example, led to the successful containment of diseases such as smallpox and polio that killed and maimed great numbers of people in earlier generations. Here in the greater San Diego area, a public-private technology partnership is in full bloom. As the San Diego Foundation reported recently, this region is home to more than 800 clean tech companies, drawn in part by more than $1 billion in clean energy investment capital, with a projected additional $1 billion expected in the coming years. That partnership is developing renewable alternatives to costly oil, to polluting coal. It's helping your communities develop clean water sources, and it's creating homegrown jobs. For much of the 20th century, science was not a political football, nor viewed as an ideological pillar of the left-leaning elite or as the scourge of the Republican right. To be sure, science has endured its trials, and ignorance has always made runs at subverting the facts. Yet when you consider that the development of rocketry, the internet, cancer treatments, were not beholden to champions of any single party or blocked by ideologues in the Congress. But over the past couple of decades, we've really seen a troubling erosion in our public conversation, in our public trust. We've seen more ideologically or corporate-sponsored misinformation injected into the debates on the floors of the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, on the floors of the state legislatures, and into our 24/7 media. Having the government declare that ketchup is a vegetable in our kids' school lunches is one of the more memorable early examples of wish triumphing over fact. But you know, many of these other examples, despite the weight of scientific evidence against them. Climate change is a hoax. Evolution is an unproven theory. Vaccines cause autism. More and more, we're seeing these kinds of misguided and often politically motivated viewpoints take hold. At the same time, we've seen partisan and mean-spirited attacks on science and scientists, unlike anything we've seen in the modern era. These regrettable developments are occurring at a time when decision makers are facing some of the most complex problems in the economic, environmental, security areas that we have confronted. And here's the thing, anti-science posturing not only undercuts incentives to find solutions and to act with foresight and purpose, it makes it difficult for political leaders to agree even on the basic facts. And when our citizens' ability to discern facts from opinion is lost, our ability to effectively address those problems and hold our elected leaders accountable is hobbled. Adam's mechanical equilibrium is out of balance. Remarkably, this is happening during an apex of exciting developments across the sciences, from our deep investigations into the building blocks of life, ferreting out genetic predisposition to disease, to understanding how our activities are affecting the chemistry of our oceans and of our atmosphere. And as one troubling consequence of this, when science is so disparaged or ignored that our best students choose other careers, and our companies can't find enough employees with adequate math and science skills, our private sector's ability to translate these wondrous discoveries into societal benefits and into prosperity, into wealth creation, is hurt too. We are convinced that this crisis requires us to move beyond a traditional issue-by-issue focus and to reawaken the hardy strand of American pragmatism that we believe remains strong, if too often dormant, among the majority of Americans. And so, the Center for Science and Democracy is inaugurated with a compelling and hugely ambitious mission: to strengthen American democracy by restoring the essential role of science, evidence-based knowledge, and constructive debate in the U.S. policymaking system. And if I can be immodest for a moment, I would say to you that the Union of Concerned Scientists is built to serve this role, just as we did starting in 2003, when we learned from scientists across federal agencies that their findings were being suppressed or sometimes mischaracterized by politically appointed officials. We connected the scientists who were feeling isolated, amplified their voices, translated their concerns into a narrative that was more widely understood. Together, we slowed or stopped the worst abuses and channeled demand for a more respectful treatment of publicly financed science. And we've seen dramatic improvements over the last 4 years. The physicists who founded UCS at MIT in 1969, at the height of the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, were intent on seeing science used to address problems and not to create destruction. Over the past 4 decades, we've tried to live up to that, and we've worked to ensure that whether it's climate, energy, agriculture, or security policy, that they are informed by rigorous science. At the Center for Science and Democracy, we will build on that record and on that experience. There's a lot of work ahead. We have a lot of details to sort out, but let me just share with you just a few components of the strategy that we think is important. In a cornerstone initiative, we will convene a series of science and democracy forums around the country to showcase science-based problem solving. Jim McCarthy and Lou Branscombe will share more details with you in just a moment on that. In another effort, we will enlist influential advocates of science from the leadership of business, education, healthcare, and religion sectors. We will look to those respected voices from across the ideological spectrum to speak forcefully about the vital role that science plays in informing government decisions that affect Americans' daily lives. The Center will also tell the stories of how the great American relationship of science and democracy has helped so many lives and lessened so much hardship. We'll expand and mobilize our network of 20,000 scientists, economists, healthcare professionals, engineers, to promote dialogue between experts and non-experts on these issues. We'll reach out to young scientists and innovators, and we'll strengthen our alliances with scientific societies, museums, universities, religious groups, and science educators. We'll recognize public officials and corporations that foster evidence-based decision-making, and we'll spotlight and discourage those whose actions are undermining public understanding of science. And we'll continue to train scientists and technical professionals to communicate more effectively about their science to non-experts and to more skillfully respond to politically motivated attacks on their work and on their credibility. We are at the very outset of an initiative that will challenge my organization, and it will challenge all of you who choose to work with us, and I hope you will, to experiment with new ideas and approaches, to reach across boundaries, and to learn as we go, all in the spirit of both science and democracy. We are both confident and humble as we embark. Ambitious as it is, we think that reinvigorating this American pragmatism is well within our collective power because of how powerfully it resonates with core American values that are really so widely held. Values like honesty, fairness, curiosity, accountability, and innovation. We welcome your input, your insights, and your support to make this initiative a grand success. Thank you so much. Thank you, and now it's a great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Jim McCarthy.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Ram, for that warm introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back here. I, as Kevin said, am a biological oceanographer, and I took my PhD at Scripps, studying with members of John Strickland's food chain research group, notably Mike Mullen, the late wife of Connie Mullen Branscombe. And it was a wonderful period. Roger Revelle slipped away before I arrived. I followed him to Harvard, and then he slipped back here, but I'm still there. And I think we used to drink beer right over here somewhere. But this facility is really, really grand. So, as Kevin said, I'm going to say a bit more about the fora. And he's given us an overview of the goals of the new center, and he articulated the compelling need for an initiative like this. But I want to tell you a little more about this centerpiece of our work, the Science and Democracy Forum series that will bring experts, decision makers, and the public together to tackle these key issues at the intersection of science and democracy. So in planning for the Center for Science and Democracy, we reflected upon the increasingly polarized political climate and its troubling disregard for science-based or evidence-based decision-making. And we thought that a powerful approach would be to institute this series of problem-solving fora in which the stakeholders and technical experts would sit with one another to discuss and develop practical solutions to pressing problems. We imagined that such an effort would be more directed than a typical academic symposium. It'd be more collaborative and practically focused than government hearings or meetings, and it would lead to the kind of promising new approaches that are sorely needed to effectively address a host of major societal problems. So showcasing such a pragmatic, nonpartisan approach, we believe can be enormously powerful if it's done right. We think it's worth much more than rhetoric in demonstrating how effectively science and democracy, which, as Kevin pointed out, share many fundamental traits, can work together when the best available scientific and technical knowledge is applied to real-world problems. The Science and Democracy Forum will bring interdisciplinary groups of scholars and practitioners together at universities, museums, academies, other institutions, wonderful centers like this, around the country to develop solutions, like how to ensure the safety of our therapeutic drugs and medical devices, or how to ensure the safety of our nation's nuclear power plants, or how to best communicate effectively key aspects of complicated subjects such as climate change. In addition to this workshop component, each of these fora will have a town hall event designed to increase public understanding of the problems at hand and to demonstrate new approaches that we can take to address them. So the Union of Concerned Scientists has already begun experimenting with prototypes for this forum. Last November, we held a very successful event in Washington, D.C. in collaboration with the George Washington University. We convened top FDA officials, consumer and patient advocates, physicians, leading academic experts to discuss ways by which the FDA could strengthen its reliance on independent scientific analysis as a means to improve its practices and make our therapeutic drugs and medical devices safer. In January, we held a forum in collaboration with the Institute for Global Sustainable Enterprise, University of Michigan, entitled Increasing public understanding of climate risk and choices. What can we learn from social science research and practice? Leading social scientists, natural scientists, business and faith leaders, and journalists from around the nation work together to identify the most effective strategies for combating misinformation about climate change and for building public understanding about the findings of climate science and the practical solutions that flow from them. The forum's public event, which focused specifically on social science research that can help improve communication related to global warming, drew an audience of 300 and was webcast worldwide. So over the past few years, as we have discussed directions, emphases, and approaches that would shape the work and enhance the prospects of success for this new venture, we benefited enormously from the wise counsel of several individuals who have deep experience at the nexus of science and democracy. Some offered financial support in addition to wise counsel, and because of them, we're able to launch this initiative. And I'm especially pleased to say that because of the generous support of one of these individuals, Lou Branscombe, we can now proceed with plans to hold a number of these forum events over the next few years. So well beyond La Jolla and Cambridge and Washington, D.C., one of the first names that comes to mind when one thinks of unrelenting advocacy for making sound science the basis of decision-making is Lou Branscombe. Lou's career is metaphor for effectiveness at the interface of science and policy. In an unusually wide-ranging activities as a scientist, a professor, advisor to presidents and other administrative officers throughout the government, to heads of corporations, to presidents of universities, in his services to professional societies and scholarly writings throughout his career, Lou has made unique contributions in society's efforts to tackle thorny scientific and technical problems. And we at the Union of Concerned Scientists have especially valued Lou's insight and encouragement as we have worked to define the goals and strategies for this new Center for Science and Democracy. So it is my privilege to announce that in honor of Lou's tremendous support and engagement in these efforts, we are formally naming the forum events of the Center for Science and Democracy, the Louis M. Branscombe Science and Democracy Forum. Lou's lifelong achievements in this arena inspire us. His name on these events will remind all who participate in the fora and all who benefit from the products of these fora of Lou's guiding vision that has shaped and helped bring these plans to fruition. Thank you, Lou Branscombe. And now we'll have some remarks from Lou.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. If my mother were only alive, she would want to be here to hear all he said, even though it was a bit extravagant, in my opinion. Our system of government is slowly but steadily morphing into a dysfunctional democracy. Too many of those whom we elect fail to fulfill their obligations to behave rationally. They are not deserving of the voters' trust, and the full span of eligible voters is insufficiently well-informed, motivated, and equipped to hold them accountable. We know some of the real reasons why our democracy is failing. Elected politicians become less and less accountable when they respond increasingly to money-specific interest and do so from the safety of their gerrymandered voting districts. The result is a voting public that has lost its confidence in their power to reverse this trend, and worse yet, is inadequately informed to be able to do so. So what does this lamentable situation have to do with science? Both democracy and science stand to benefit enormously when our political leaders and the public come to understand that the traditions of science and the mechanics of democracy have common roots. The rational behavior of our government does indeed depend on the role that science has played in the thinking of the founding fathers, as Kevin pointed out. Both American democracy and modern science are products of the 18th century Enlightenment, which emphasized reason and openness rather than on belief in religious and political authority. In a constitutional structure based on checks and balances, a government system based on rational decision and compromise is essential. American democracy has always benefited from a pragmatic willingness to learn from experience, very much as science relies on experiment. Progress in science is based on transparency, accountability, evidence, and verification. Science can be successfully applied because of trust, earned through adherence to these same basic principles that in fact underlie a sustainable democracy. Thus, science and democracy can both flourish when government is pragmatic, open, and viewed by the voters as legitimate, because its decisions are based on facts. If science knowledge is distorted and corrupted by self-interested politics, government itself is in danger of losing its legitimacy. And conversely, when government allows itself to become corrupt, science advice and science itself are sure to suffer as well. For an example, recognizing our inadequate system of public education, is it too surprising that in the USA, only 38% of poll respondents believe that the scientists themselves have reached agreement on the need for urgent action on climate change? The polling organization Public Agenda finds that a majority of Americans recognize that driving cars does indeed contribute a lot to global warming. But 6 in 10 Americans can't name a renewable energy source, and believe it or not, 40% of Americans can't even name a fossil fuel. Dependence on foreign oil worries 60% of Americans, but only 32% worry about global warming. Instead, they worry about the price of gasoline. Technical experts have for a long time been telling the public about the urgency of climate change and the changes of energy import, the challenges, dangers of energy import dependence. But despite all this information, the message is sent, but not the message received. That's a quote from Dan Yankelovich. Thus, if we are to preserve a legitimate and accountable system of government and enjoy the fruits of an intelligently informed society, government must be responsive to a voting public that can best understand the fruits of scientific endeavor. And science must more effectively share with the public what we know and how we know it. Decisions in government as in science must, in short, be fact-based. Is there any hope that Americans can make this happen? Yes, I think there is. President George H.W. Bush supported the scientific findings about the cause of ozone hole in the atmosphere and successfully led the International Montreal Protocol to ban the production of chlorofluorocarbons used in aerosol sprays and refrigerators and other applications. When released into the atmosphere, these chlorofluorocarbons removed the ozone, and the result was to allow the excess ultraviolet to cause skin cancer. As recently as 2008, in the presidential campaign, both Senators McCain and Obama supported the importance of climate science and the need to act in response to its findings. Not long ago, many conservatives and liberals accepted the scientific evidence that global climate change is caused in the release of greenhouse gases, in large part from the burning of fossil fuels. During the 2008 presidential campaign, Barack Obama made repeated reference to the importance of rational, pragmatic government. He talked about that a lot. Dan Yankelovich indeed gave some lectures about the fact that Obama was concentrating on this idea. Only recently, in fact, May 18, Jeffrey Zients, the current acting director of the Office of Management and Budget, issued a directive to all the heads of government and agencies on how they should prepare their contributions to the next budget series. And here's the quote from the first part of that directive. Since taking office, the President has emphasized the need to use evidence and rigorous evaluation to budget, management, and policy decisions to make government work effectively. When evidence is strong, we should act on it. When evidence is suggestive, we should consider it. And when evidence is weak, we should build the knowledge to support better decisions in the future. This document proceeds to detail 4 pages of specific instructions on fact-based evidence when submitting budgetary material in the government. Now, there are many in the House and Senate, and in both parties, who will support this approach. However, the battle for rational, fact-based government is far from won. Half of the 100 new members of the Congress in 2010 are climate change deniers, largely for ideological reasons. In response to this rising opposition to mainstream climate science, the President now focuses on energy strategy rather than on climate change itself. Legislative action in the U.S. now seems beyond reach even for a better energy strategy. How can the Union of Concerned Scientists help Americans seek a governance system that is more rational, pragmatic, and responsible to the electorate? Technical experts whose work is relevant to complex public issues must earn the trust of the public and learn to communicate via the media. We must provide voters with the information that is not only reliable, but is relevant to the voters' concerns and responsive to the way that the public makes decisions on public issues. Science deniers who choose to reject the evidence from the best science, and also many politicians more dependent on their self-interest campaign donors than their constituents, will be hard to persuade. The Center for Science and Democracy, through its forum programs, will promote a national dialogue focused on more rational and pragmatic policies for the technical complexities that our society faces now and in the future. There are many issues that need this kind of discussion, and new ones are arising every day. So let me mention just a couple of examples that are now in the newspapers and being discussed in public. The first is the Plan B one-step, or better known as the morning after pill, to prevent unwanted pregnancy. The most recent scientific understanding of how the pill works conflicts with the widespread belief that, in fact, this pill is a biochemical abortion. It actually operates by inhibiting ovulation and thus preventing fertilization. It should not be confused with terminating a pregnancy. The second example is hydrofracking. The dramatic increase in natural gas production in hydraulic fracturing raises concerns about the contamination of the water table and also the release of methane, which is itself a powerful greenhouse gas. And while some environmentalists are calling for shutting down hydraulic fracturing altogether, recent studies by the International Energy Agency have put out a report saying that natural gas can safely be extracted by this method, but only if all the steps in this process are rigorously regulated. And I'll let you guess how likely that is to happen in this government. The forum will bring together, in a nonpartisan environment, the best informed natural and social scientists, visionary leaders from industry, politicians with open minds, and most importantly, students and postdocs from our universities. The forum will strive to make these discussions of selected policy issues fact-based and pragmatic. The results shall also be made available to the public and to the Congress. Restoring the tradition of fact-based policymaking and rebuilding the trust of the public will not be easy. Indeed, this is a formidable task. What institutions can take the lead in a national discussion of this issue? I believe the Union of Concerned Scientists, in collaboration with other institutions that Kevin has mentioned, can make progress toward a rational system of government from which we and the rest of the world will all benefit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lou, and thank you, Jim. Lou, we're so deeply honored by your deep engagement in our new center and in the forum. So now on to our panel discussion, and it is a great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Casey Cole, who is a professor at the Annenberg School of Journalism at USC. She's a prolific author. Most recently, she's the author of Something Incredibly Wonderful Happens, Frank Oppenheimer and the World He Made Up, which is a memoir biography of her late mentor, the uncle of the atomic bomb. She is the author of 9 nonfiction books, including the international bestseller, The Universe and the Teacup, The Mathematics of Truth and Beauty. She is a longtime science correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and her writing has also appeared in a few other publications you might have heard of, The New Yorker, The New York Times, Wired, Newsweek, Esquire, Ms., The Washington Post, and many other publications. Casey Cole.
Thank you. Hi, welcome everybody. It's fun to see a lot of old friends here today. And our panel, I think, is going to be an absolutely great, lively discussion. We have such a deep well of knowledge, depth of knowledge, and breadth of experience. So we're really going to have some fun. I was asked to, in 2 minutes, give an overarching view of science democracy from a journalist's point of view. We do respect deadlines, so I'm probably going to do it as best I can. I'm going to be really, really close. I started off as a political journalist, and when I came into science, it was through the door of physics. And one of the things that amazed me right at the outset was the relevance of physics to journalism, big ideas from it. For example, there is such thing as real objective truth, even in journalism, although people would argue with that, and science. But what you see depends on how you look, and the answers you get depend on the questions you ask. That means that journalists have to be really careful to understand and report not just what they're seeing and hearing, but also who's doing the talking and what their point of view is. Obviously, democracy can't function unless people can sensibly vote on issues, and they can't do that when they're left at the mercy of the media to tell them which of the many facts that they're being thrown at them continuously are right. They just give up after a while and start following whatever pundit they were following in the first place. So this deliberate confusion that's been sowed about science, I think is even more dangerous than it seems on the surface, because it not only leads to an uninformed public, it leads to an apathetic public. And when people give up, they just stop trying to understand anything. Frank Oppenheimer always used to say that when we stop trying to understand things, we'll all be sunk. And I think that's true. As I said, my initial interest in science came from physics, but today I think the area that's most pertinent to journalism is actually neuroscience, the study of our own brains, how we make decisions. We didn't evolve to survive in a world with nuclear weapons or climate change or instant global communications or these very complex challenges that require reflective thought based on real evidence, reasoned analysis, hard-won facts. So one of my smartest journalism students, Callie Schweitzer, who went on to become almost immediately the associate publisher of Talking Points Memo, which is quite influential in Washington, did a project for me on the neuroscience of multitasking, because Callie was a superb multitasker. So she thought, what she realized, of course, was that there is no such thing as multitasking. One simply switches rapidly from one thing to another. And one thing that really surprised her was that older people have a harder time with this multitasking than younger people because, she said, they experience so much more internal chatter. Well, by the second time she said internal chatter, I said, you know, Callie, that's what some of us would call thinking. It's actually a little scary because the media landscape today is so disjointed and so geared towards short attention spans that it's fair to wonder whether we even have time to process some of the higher cognitive functions that we need to understand these issues. Now, some people will tell you that science journalism is dead already, and it has disappeared from most major newspapers, from most magazines, from most television and radio. It's just gone there. But it would be a big mistake to infer that that means the public doesn't want this information. I was actually very amused by a poll that the Pew Foundation did a little while ago that had to do with newspaper readership in science. And it said something like, well, only 15% of people actually follow science in the newspaper. And I thought, how can they follow it if it's not there? What can that number even possibly mean? We know people care. We have evidence from the fact that they read science books, they read blogs, they go to science museums. We have much, much evidence. And in a way, I think a good thing about the new competitive media environment is that journalists have had to go back to what is an older form of journalism, which is storytelling. Find a great story and tell it. Not this he said, she said nonsense. It gives the reader absolutely no information on which to base a judgment and is also really boring. So there's hope. Actually, some positive developments in science journalism have come from some really odd places, and I hope we have some fans here. Fake journalists like Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert have done a wonderful job of making people laugh and getting them to think straight, and their work on science and phony science and climate change has just been excellent. If you haven't seen these videos going around, they're absolutely brilliant. So they know how to ask questions. So I just wanted to end with something else that my late mentor Frank Oppenheimer used to talk about a lot. There was a need for social inventions. Through understanding how bacteria work, we can make antibiotics. By understanding of scientific concepts, we can make scientific inventions that help make the world better. But we also need social inventions like families and traffic lights and the United Nations to help societies run better. And I think this center, well, first, science is a social invention, as is democracy, as is journalism. But I think this center really has the potential to bring all of these together in a way to gain the kind of deep understanding that will produce a lot of much, much needed social inventions. And in the meantime, give journalists and policymakers and scientists the resources they need to do a better job of what they're already doing. So with that, we're going to go right into our panel. We're going to talk amongst ourselves first for about a half an hour, and then we're going to move to questions, which can be directed either toward the panelists or to Kevin or to Peter, who will. David Baltimore is somebody I've known a very long time, from when he was president at Caltech, and we've done a lot of lot of interesting work together. I don't think I have to say anything about David Baltimore. He's probably the most important biologist in America today, and his work on the civic side of things is also enormously rich. Naomi Oreskes, I met just recently. I just finished last night her book, Merchants of Doubt. It's a must-read book. I have to say, it reminded me of, I once asked Frank, I said, why didn't you atomic scientists make people, scared of nuclear weapons? And he says, it doesn't do any good to make people scared. You have to make them angry. Your book made me really angry. So it's a really, really good book. Mary Nichols, I don't know. We've just gotten to know each other a little bit. She is was reappointed recently as chairman of the California Air Resources Board by Jerry Brown, who you'd worked with previously before Schwarzenegger, and is also a lawyer, so she promises to bring sparks into our conversation. And John Porter, who I also just met, is the chair of Research America and vice chair of the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, and I will say on and on and on, a congressman. He's involved in a lot of issues having to do with education, human rights, and so forth. So we will sit down. We have 3 questions, not just 3, but we're going to start with 3. So I'll go.
Well, it's complicated. When I was listening to Kevin talk just now, I was thinking it's easy to romanticize the relationship between science and democracy, and I think it's easy to overplay the role of people like Benjamin Franklin. And there's certainly a long history in our democracy of people being skeptical about science, of seeing it as an elitist and frankly undemocratic or anti-democratic activity. So I don't think we want to overstate that claim. But I do think that what's probably correct and wouldn't be overstated would just be to say that knowledge is central to democracy and always has been, and that the founding fathers certainly recognized that. And information. The whole concept of a citizenry, a democracy, voting and making decisions is based on the idea that citizens have access to information, to good information on which they can make decisions and choose who their representatives can be. And I think that's why we see freedom of the press and freedom of the speech in the First Amendment of the Constitution. So I think it's really that piece about information and knowledge. And so that doesn't mean only scientific information. There are many kinds of information that are relevant in democracy, but certainly scientific information is one kind of important knowledge. And I think it's a kind of knowledge that many historians would agree has become increasingly important since the founding of the Republic.
And probably most directly because a scientist who deliberately makes stuff up is going to be ostracized, and it would be really nice if we could do that to politicians, and it'd be nice if that's calls in this.
Indeed.
How about you, Mary?
Well, I guess my thought when you raised that question earlier was that I think of both science and democracy as being built on the notion that knowing things can make life better, that they relate to in a very human way. It's true that science is supposed to be neutral, I suppose, in some sense. You wouldn't want to know things just because you want to know things. But doing science seems to me to pretty much always come out of some desire, not just to understand for the sake of curiosity, but also out of a fundamental belief that if we do understand how the universe works or how our brains work or our bodies work, that we can use that information for something positive. And there is that historical connection, as people have been pointing out, going back to the founding of the United States, but beyond the United States, when the beginnings of organized science around the world were very much tied to that notion of betterment of the human condition. It's about us. Yeah, it's all about us.
Of course, it's all about us. Well, we better get a little smarter if it's going to be all about us for very long. But so David?
When I saw that question, 2 things. One is, first of all, the question of whether there's a reciprocal relationship between science and democracy. And I've always been impressed by how undemocratic regimes can still have very powerful science. So I don't think it goes that way, but it goes the other way. Because only in an undemocratic regime can you have anti-science. And the place where I see that most strikingly was in the Soviet Union when Lysenko directed the thinking about genetics, and Stalin supported that, and therefore it became public policy in the country, and nobody could argue against it. And Mendel's genetics, which was by that time very well established, was denied. And they created some pseudoscience. And no country could have done that unless there was absolute control from a dictatorial position. The other thing that struck me when I thought about it is that science and democracy are, at least to me, processes, not nouns. They're almost, I mean, they're not really verbs, but they're ways of doing things. And I've tried for a long time to think of a definition of science, a sort of, what's your elevator speech definition of science? And I found it very difficult. But it is sort of organized honesty. It's an attempt to set in place a series of criteria that allow you to feel that you've come to an understanding. And democracy, similarly, is a process. It's a process that, as Lou was saying, has been slightly bastardized by the ability of, particularly, and you, I don't know that you did in fact say this, by the ability of money to completely dominate the political process. And that, the Citizens United decision is the most undemocratic decision that I think I've ever seen, and is subverting our democracy in just egregious ways. And what it did was get in the way of the process of democracy. So science and democracy are very important concepts. They're the fundaments of our society, but they're ways of doing business.
Yeah.
They're not facts.
Right. But I'd like to have John, who's actually in the...
So, all of you are wondering, who is this guy and what's he doing up there and why is he with this distinguished group? And I understand that. I'll tell you one other thing. I'm a moderate Republican. I should be in a museum. I chair Research America, and all of you ought to know what it is, and all of you, your institutions, all ought to be members, because what we do is impact by education and advocacy the important role of science as a national priority and the funding of science every single day, all around the country, and particularly aimed at Congress and the administration. So I hope that we're the only organization that is devoted purely to advocating for science, purely. Now, why is this center needed? In the materials we got, it says, restore the rightful place of science to advising democracy, basically. Why would we have to restore it? Wasn't that all finished in 1925 with the Scripps trial? Didn't we know the place of science in society? And then we had, about 30 years later, 35 years later, C.P. Snow gave a famous lecture called The Gulf of Mutual Incomprehension. All of you are scientists, you probably realize that one. There is a tremendous gulf, that's 50 years ago, a tremendous gulf between what people in America understand about science and science itself. And scientists don't talk to the people, and the people don't understand scientists or science. That is a tremendous problem in this country, and the center is designed to address it. And it deserves the support of every single person caring about science. I believe that the whole future of this country, this society, our economic destiny, depends on science, technology, innovation, research, mathematics, engineering. Those things are going to carry us forward, or they're not. And if we don't support them, and if we don't correct the people who come to tell us wrong things about science, we are going to lose it all. And I'll finish this question by saying, this election is the most important election in my lifetime, and I'm plenty old. And it is going to determine the direction of this country for a long time to come. And the people of science had better get involved every day in impacting the public and the policymakers in determining what the future of this country is going to be and what science's place in it is going to be.
Thank you. Before we move to the next question, I'd like to maybe tie these threads together a little bit, or something that struck me about what everybody was saying had in common. The idea of science and democracy as a process about being essential to our economy and national security. How one person can make a difference. Lysenko, through Stalin, through his power, destroyed Soviet agriculture, right? It didn't recover for 40 years or something like that. Well, it could have happened here. There is a very interesting book written about, and the reason I thought of Naomi's book too, because you bring up the point that whereas we're very good at pointing out singular good people who made a difference, we're not really good at seeing how a singular bad person can make a difference unless they're really horrible, like Hitler or something like that. And there's a wonderful book called A Matter of Security by Stern that talks about how the process of Manhattan Project, about the building of the atomic bomb, and the fact that the general put in charge really didn't care about people's politics. He just wanted science. Politics was not allowed to interfere. This was a bunch of lefties, a bunch of pacifists. I think only Einstein was left out because he really was a pacifist. But generally, they were, communists and lefties. Hitler, on the other side, said, no Jews. Well, that eliminated most of German science. And, you had to be a good Nazi. What would have happened if that had been reversed? What if over here we had a hard political boot on what our scientists could do and who they could be, and in Germany, they hadn't. Things could have been very different. So I thought that was a really interesting thought experiment about how, one person's decision, had it been otherwise, everything could have changed.
Well, in the history of the field that I've worked in most of my life, which is environmental policy, the fact that Ed Muskie stuck to his guns on the Clean Air Act and said the basis for national health standards is going to be health science, and we're not going to add in a factor about cost or even feasibility. We'll think about that later when we actually try to implement the standards, but we're going to have national standards that are based on a definition that is purely grounded in science. Changed everything and made the Clean Air Act far and away the most powerful regulatory statute, and the one that the right has been trying ever since to destroy, just for that reason.
So we don't, through our political processes and through journalism as well, but mainly through, basically make the country safe for science. We need to do that through making it more democratic and making science able to function. I think that's very interesting. Okay, our second question, I guess, follows on this in a way. These questions are a bit arbitrary. The second question we decided to talk about was, why is it that so many people are so skeptical of science and even disdainful of it, and proud of their attitude? And what kinds of things can we do to help correct that?
Another small question.
Well, I'll just continue on from where I was.
Okay.
Because if you see science as a process, then during the formative stages of one's thinking life, that is, while you're being educated, you should be educated to think scientifically. And we've allowed ourselves to think that you should learn about the facts of science the facts of the world. You should fill in the blanks in the sentence. How many elements are there? I don't care how many elements there are. And I can't ever remember, for that matter.
It keeps changing.
And it keeps changing, right.
Spoken like a true biologist.
Yeah. Right. So I think the answer to your question really is rooted in our educational system, which doesn't do a good job teaching people about evidence-based decision-making and probability.
But we can't wait.
Well, we're going to have to figure out how to muddle along in the world we are today. I completely agree.
Yeah.
But we also should be putting in place the fundaments for our children and our children's children.
I have a slightly different view. I mean, I agree
Yeah.
that science education is terribly important. And I also have sometimes, since I teach history of science, thought about, well, what is this word science? And I've always thought of science essentially as being two things. One is the body of what we would say knowledge, factual knowledge, scientific knowledge, and the other is the process by which that knowledge is obtained. But as a historian, you always think about, you know, what's really different and what's the same, how much is plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. So for me, I think the educational piece, it's important, but people have been complaining about science in America, you know, since Benjamin Franklin. It's a very, very old complaint. People have been trying to reform public education, as far as I can tell, since the founding of the Republic. But what it seems to me has really changed in a really clear and tangible way that I think you can see in the history of the 20th century especially. Is this me that's doing all that weird feedback? Oh, it's that? Can that be turned off or something?
Well, turn it away anyway.
Turn it away, yeah, it's kind of distracting. Thank you, Jim. Actually, it's the way in which scientists speak to the public. And one of the things that I've seen in my own work on the history of the 20th century is a really significant change from, say, the first half of the 20th century, before World War II, to the second half.
Yeah.
Before World War II, it was very, very common for leading scientists, distinguished scientists, to reach out to the public in many different kinds of ways, writing popular books, radio broadcasts were very popular in the 1920s and 30s, articles written by scientists in major magazines and newspapers. And of course, that still continues today to some extent. There are some wonderful examples of prominent scientists who have written fabulous popular books. But in general, as a generalization, after World War II, you see that dropping off. And one of the paradoxes to me about that is that it seems to drop off at the very same time that we are creating crucial scientific institutions like the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. And as a historian, my read of this is that actually scientists began to feel less responsible to the general public, that as there was a more robust funding structure for science that was organized largely by scientists and through a peer review process where science was being judged by other scientists, that the scientific community actually became more insular than it had been before World War II. And that was good for scientific research in many ways. We developed this incredibly powerful and productive scientific research apparatus, but it was bad for public communication. And so I don't think it's the only reason, but I do think it's one of the things that has contributed to the current state of affairs, where people don't even know what a fossil fuel is. Oh my God.
No, that's true.
So let me continue with what I have to say before I insult all of you. I was an appropriator and served in Congress for 21 years. I chaired the subcommittee that funded all the health programs and all the education programs of the federal government, including NIH and CDC and ARC and all the rest. My chief claim to fame is that when Republicans took over the House of Representatives in 1995 and I became chairman, I prevented the cuts to NIH, which were then put in the Republican budget at 5% a year for 5 years, or 25%. And then we increased NIH and began the process, which was completed, of doubling NIH from $13.5 billion to $27 billion. The baseline is twice what it was at the end of that time. I say that because I have a huge respect for scientists. Scientists are the most respected people in America. How many of you consider yourselves themselves to be scientists. Quite a few. I had 20 years of the subcommittee, 20 years of exposure to NIH and all of its directors of all the institutes, and we met with the Nobel laureates once every year. I think David was there one of those years. I have a huge respect for you. But God darn it, science has been sitting on its fingers. For years and years and years, the money flowed in. Did you notice in 2003 it stopped flowing? You should have. And it's been a long, long time now where it's been flat funded, and with inflation it's gone down. And what has science done about it? The only group I know that's done anything about it is the Union of Concerned Scientists. The rest of them say, oh, we'll let it go. You can't let it go. You heard all these things where people get, how many of you heard of the Toomey Amendment? The Toomey Amendment.
Oh, this
None
is
of you.
climate change?
No. And I retired after that period of time in 2001. In 2003, there was an amendment on the floor of the House of Representatives by a fellow named Patrick Toomey, who was a member from Pennsylvania. It was to tell NIH that it could not fund certain research because it contained references to sex.
Oh.
I'm serious. Do you know that amendment lost on the floor of the House of Representatives 211 to 212? And where was science? Now this fellow headed the Club for Growth that has gone after, you probably heard of that group, gone after every moderate Republican. I retired before they got to me. But he's now the senator from Pennsylvania and beat Arlen Specter, the champion of NIH in the Senate.
We do have to, we
I know,
have
I'm
to
going
move
too
on.
long.
But I think you raised, actually, what,
My point is that science has to stop talking to other scientists, start talking to the public in a way that they can understand, and engage with people. Instead of talking to each other and spending all the time in the lab, you've got to get out and engage, because they never hear from you, and if they don't hear from you, what are they going to do?
The thing I thought you were going to reference was actually reported probably on Colbert a couple of nights ago, that a certain state has mandated that the sea level rise shall only be a certain number of inches. That's a law now.
Well, we talked about this in
Virginia,
class.
you're not allowed to use those words.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So this gets worse. And it's also obvious that to everybody, but I just have to add to the journalistic point of view, is on the internet, everybody's an expert, they're anonymous, they're rude, they've got agendas, and so that's certainly changed the dynamic of how people feel about science.
But if we could about that sea level rise law, because we talked about it in class the other day, and we used Stephen Colbert's clip, and he's, of course, great and hilariously funny, and if you haven't seen his clip called Sink or Swim, you have to see it.
It's very funny.
But, it's tricky, too, because it's funny, and it's good that he's funny, but it's actually really frightening. And if you read the law, as we did in class, it isn't just that it says that only historic data will be used and no models, and only linear projections and no accelerated projections. It also forbids any state agency from making sea level rise forecasts except the coastal North Carolina Coastal Resources Board, which is a board composed almost entirely of business people, land developers, things like that. So, one doesn't want to overreact, and one doesn't want to say, oh my God, we're living in the Soviet Union. And yet when you see something like that, which is essentially a gag order against actual scientific work, you have to start becoming alarmed or angry. And then the question is, what's the right degree of anger at that point?
So I want to tell you a success story. I'm going to flip this conversation because we live in horrible times, and we can all agree that, it's terrible. The state of California has a climate law which is the equivalent of the Kyoto Treaty, which isn't enough, but then it's added to a longer-term goal of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. Why do we have that law? We have that law in large part because of people who are based at this institution and people who are in this room today. And I just want to share a little bit of that story. Okay, so we go back now to, say, 2000, when the Union of Concerned Scientists, was it 2000, 2001, published a report which used a lot of information that was generated here at Scripps about the effect of climate change on the snowpack in California. And the fact that that study came out and that there were the nice graphics that it had became the basis for some initial steps. We didn't start with a climate law in California. We started out just registering emissions and looking at where the sources were. And that was where it began, was with a registry, which then spun off. And then eventually we did annual reports to the legislature. And then eventually, thanks to several leaders and to the efforts of national environmental groups who decided they could use California as a laboratory for something that might eventually go national, we did pass the law in California, and we are implementing it. And we are seeing the results of that law in year-by-year actual reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not here because I want everybody to feel that everything is good in the state of California, because our programs are constantly under threat. And frankly, the success of those laws is part of what's giving rise to the efforts that are going on in places like North Carolina,
Exactly.
because the people who hate what we're doing have decided they're not going to let it happen anywhere else. And
yeah.
they're on the march. But if it hadn't been for the science that was neatly packaged and interpreted by people who were able to play that communications role, we would not be making the progress that we're making today. And so I'm really hoping that we can get, before we sink into gloom here or into the sea, that we can talk a little bit more about what can be done.
Well,
in
we
this
will.
situation.
Actually, we're kind of out of time for our questions. We're supposed to go to the public, but our final question ties in with this, and you're probably the best person, certainly one of them, to address it anyway, and that's, is there something special about California that things happen here that can happen other places? And can that be a model? Can that be a platform, from which we affect other people? Why could it happen in California? It's not like we have a legislature that...
No, they're not
Functions.
brighter than your average legislature. As a whole, I would say. There's some pretty good people. There really are. There are. But no, I think certainly we have to go back to the respect that has existed in this state and the very close relationship between state government and the university over a period of years. And we can, that is in danger at the moment because of the horrible economic climate that we live in. But I would say that with respect to science and democracy, where we started, California has an interesting governmental structure, which it consists of a lot of boards and commissions that run programs where the members who make the decisions are appointed and confirmed by the legislature, but they have to fulfill certain criteria that are based on expertise in a particular area, not just being elected or being a friend of the governor. And there is a tradition of appointing people like my former colleague Robert Sawyer, who's a professor emeritus at Berkeley, who's one of the world's leading experts on combustion, to a board that actually regulated automobiles, or my current colleague Dan Sperling, who runs the Institute of Transportation Sciences at UC Davis. People like that who are willing to take time to come and serve in the government because they feel that their service will be respected and that they'll have an opportunity to actually shape decisions. And I think you have to have that kind of structure, make those things possible.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely important point, because that's certainly not true on a lot of federal level commissions. So we have questions coming from the audience. I think we have mics going around. We have web questions coming from webcast.
And also in the Discord.
And written. So,
Where are they?
so first we'll just take actual real people. Do you want a mic here? Okay, you've got the
Real
mic.
people.
Just really quickly.
Nope.
Sorry. What's the difference between Research America and the Union of Concerned Scientists?
Well, I can speak for Research America. Research America is an organization of about 500 academic health centers, corporations, professional societies, and the like, concerned solely with advocacy and education for science. Particularly, began It began strictly on medical science or medical research, but now it includes all research because all science is in this together.
Yeah, I can't see very well in the back, so it's going to be, unless I stand up, so it's going to be hard for me to choose.
I've read Merchants of Doubt, and I'm here to ask the Forum and the Union of Concerned Scientists, where's the punch? I understand about fora and getting people involved and maybe inspiring younger people, but how do you influence politics? And I happen to be a physician, and in my life, the big public health victory was the victory over tobacco and their doubt. And that's what Susan's book is about. Made me cry, not only just get angry, I cried almost every page. But our great public health victory was a victory over science, over corporations and money, and doubt. And it is a model for the future, except I've taught classes on this as a case study, and a lot of it happened by happenstance and accident, including President Kennedy's press conference where he was asked what he thought about the relationship between smoking and cancer. It was a planted question, and he didn't even have to answer it, but he formed a committee, the president's first committee on smoking. But with that great victory, which was not planned, came the strategy of all the corporations to destroy the rest of the world and science itself, which is best documented in that book.
Yeah.
And so I understand our scientific approach to spreading education, but I would challenge you all to tell me, how are you going to influence the political process? I have not heard one word about that yet.
Well, why don't we just direct that question to Naomi, since you wrote the book, and see if...
Thank you, but maybe Peter wants to say something.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to say something about what we're doing tomorrow and Friday?
Sure. I'm going to forget my closing comments, but I'll just say a few words. So, as Naomi's book, by the way, so as Naomi's book so artfully points out, there is a lot to learn from the history of tobacco regulation, and it is a success story looking backwards today. So today, no one seriously denies the health risks of tobacco, and we do have appropriate kinds of controls in place and regulations. We're actually in a third example. I think Jim McCarthy mentioned a couple of examples of what we're doing in test driving this forum. Actually, over the next 2 days here at Scripps, we're bringing together folks who were involved in the legal battles over tobacco, scholars who are looking at the history of tobacco, including Naomi, climate scientists, public opinion experts, to really draw upon the history of tobacco regulation. What did we learn from that? And figure out what we can apply, if anything, to the control of climate change. So we want to really take a very deliberate look. Now, this is very much in the spirit, this is not a Branscombe Science and Democracy Forum event, but it is in the spirit of test driving that model. And we're going to come out of that, I hope, with ideas, with opportunities, with strategies, with dialogue across experts and practitioners that would not happen but for that conversation. And out of that may come, and this is really a hypothesis we're testing, some actions that we can take in the political as well as in the scholarly realm. So stay tuned.
That would be great. You know, I got some really interesting questions from the people who are watching the webcast. So if I can, I'd like to raise a couple of them. One of them is, do scientists jeopardize their credibility by engaging in political debates and advocacy? And I know people go back and forth on that. So I guess that's a good question for David.
Well, the answer, I think, is yes. Because when you become an advocate, you sort of accept the good with the bad. It's very hard to be a pure advocate of a candidate, for instance, or of a bill for that matter, and not be willing to accept things that you don't really believe in. The political process is described always as a process of consensus building and compromise. And that's exactly antithetical to science. I never compromise when I think about a scientific problem. I try to find out what's really going on and I'm not accepting what somebody else is thinking just because I'm being nice to them. You can't be nice about science. So there is a real issue there. And, in a sense, when you say scientists should go out and talk to the public, they can talk about their science.
Yes.
But when they become advocates for almost anything, even themselves, they're compromising.
But I think this is a super important
Yeah.
issue for the scientific community and for
Right,
this group.
right.
Because I think that
Yeah.
it's too black and white to say there's science and there's advocacy. There's a huge
Yeah,
realm in between.
exactly.
And there are many examples of prominent, famous scientists in the history of science who have spoken up on issues of human and social import and have still maintained their credibility as scientists. And my favorite example of that is someone we just lost, which was Sherry Rowland, who, was beloved by virtually everyone who knew him. And I think Sherry's example is a crucially important one because he's the man who first, along with Mario Molina, one of our colleagues here, and Paul Crutzen, said that CFCs could deplete stratospheric ozone and won the Nobel Prize for that work in 1995, which he shared with Crutzen and Molina. And when you think about that example, it seems to me what they did was crucial because who else but them could have told us about ozone depletion? None of us sitting here at the beach would know that we were getting more UV radiation, right? We couldn't feel it, we couldn't see it, we couldn't measure it ourselves, we couldn't predict it. It took an expert chemist to predict that those reactions could take place, and it took expert scientists, including people like Susan Solomon and others, to go out in the world and measure it and to tell us that this was happening and to tell us why it mattered. Now, you can draw the line, as Susan, for example, has said, and say, it's my job to tell you why it matters. It's not my job to say exactly what the solution is. That's one way to draw that line. There are other ways that can be done as well. But unless the scientists had told us about ozone depletion, we would be seeing increasing rates of melanoma, and we wouldn't know why.
Exactly.
And people like you would be writing the articles about the scientists arguing about what was causing the rise in melanoma.
Right. But wasn't it also true that in the 1920s, I mean, when you were talking about scientists being more out with their articles and letters, interviewing Einstein and all of that, they were also more advocates. I mean, Einstein talked a great deal about human problems, racism, economic inequity, as being
Absolutely.
so.
Or William Ritter, who we have a hall for named just over there. I mean, wonderful book by Phil Pauly, who sadly died recently, about William Ritter, and the book is called Biology and the Promise of American Life. I mean, Ritter was absolutely explicit that he thought that this institution existed to use science to make life in America better. So,
Did you wanna,
yeah, sure, go ahead.
2 quick points. The culture of most academic institutions is to discourage public engagement, not to reward it, but to actually discourage it.
Yeah.
That has to change because scientists are so credible. If they don't get engaged, and I'm sorry, David, you just can't stay above a fray when the ground is slipping out from under you.
Hey, wait.
Oh, did I say something?
I've never advocated staying above the fray, and I have, as you say, I've testified in Washington. I've worked for things I believe in. But I have, in that process, recognized that there is a balance between advocacy and absolute honesty, and that you have to accept the good with the bad if you're going to work in a political framework.
I disagree with that. You can advise. I would recommend that every single member of Congress, every single candidate for Congress, have a science advisor, somebody from the science community saying, I want to advise you on science. They don't have to listen, but they have to hear it. And a lot of people, you know what we do? We all talk to people who don't need to be talked to, who already agree with us. We need to talk to those people who don't agree with us, who don't understand us. We need to hear a message they will never hear if the science community doesn't step up and tell them. Because you have the credibility to do it.
But, if you put yourself out there as a scientist and you say things that any well-funded group disagrees with, you are personally going to be shredded. Let's be honest about this. We're not living in a world anymore where it's just advocacy versus purity. It's about the fact that if someone becomes known, whatever their credentials may be for taking a position on an issue which is in play at the moment, everything about their personal life, every peccadillo that they may have ever had is subject to public discussion and revelation. It may not have anything to do with the matter at hand, but you got to have a mighty tough skin, and you've got to, be willing to do more than most people are willing to do.
I'm
to
not talking
engage.
about standing up and making speeches on the corner. I'm talking about going in and seeing people and saying, this is an important discipline, an important priority for this country, and here's why.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not.
Scientists
You don't have to
have
run.
been punished.
I would love to see you run for office, but scientists are very hard to even get engaged, let alone run. It'd be wonderful if we had a whole Congress full of scientists. We have 5% maybe that have any scientific background.
Right.
They don't get it. They need to be told.
But we have to recognize, too, that
No,
some
maybe not.
scientists who do speak
We know
up
that.
have been, they've had their hands slapped pretty badly, and they're just getting used to this idea of having a harder skin. So that's a...
Well, democracy's not a...
Yeah,
it's a
well,
kind of a blood sport.
politicians, what if journalists, and God forbid you say anything about, abortion or anything, you're going to be shredded. So
Casey,
that's part of the world we live in
a question
today.
over here.
Should we take a
We
question?
have a question over here.
Oh, we have questions
Hi.
everywhere.
I apologize in advance for asking a complicated multi-part question, but this has sort of been occupying my whole life for the last few years. I run a company called Empowered Energy Solutions, and we do something very practical. We take existing buildings and we retrofit them so that they become sustainable, which obviously has the effect of radically, or could potentially radically reduce the total amount of environmental impact that our society creates. Now, 2 years ago, we crossed through what I think is a very fundamental threshold, which was the point at which a project to make a building completely sustainable would cost less from day one than the alternative of simply purchasing fossil fuels to power that building. And since that time, we've seen less than 2% adoption of sustainability in our existing building stock. So our buildings in America are, for the most part, just as inefficient as they've always been, even though the solution is cheaper than the problem. So my questions, I guess I should say, are this. One, how can I most effectively propagate this knowledge, the fact that we've crossed over this very important threshold, through the popular consciousness? And two, if the fact that the solution is better than the problem in every sense, including the financial, from day one, isn't enough for us to profoundly change how we interact with our existing building stock, what is necessary to create the sea change that we must see in order for our society to reduce this important cause of our global environmental impact?
Thank you. I think almost anybody could.
Well, let me take a start. We are in a period of transition in our economy. I don't think much of anybody would deny the fact that we are moving and will move and need to move in the direction of more energy efficiency, better use of declining stocks of fossil fuels. The question is not whether, it's how fast and who's going to pay. And those are issues that are inherently political. The kinds of facts that you have stated there, and I'm going to assume that they're true because I don't know any different, are relevant to that discussion, because if you can get them in the hands of people whose job it is to do things like set standards for new buildings, or who can decide on where money is going to be spent in retrofitting old buildings, they can incorporate that information, and they will. But probably you, as the person who's running that business, are not going to be the right messenger. You're probably going to have to find other people and organizations who will take that cause up and use you as a case study or as an example. But you could, if you spent your time knocking on doors, it would not be very effective, and at the end of the day, you wouldn't be running your business either. So I think that's part of why we're here, is to think about what kinds of institutions, what kinds of programs can help take this information and make the change that needs to happen faster.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I mean, at risk of sounding like a stereotyped professor and recommending a book, there's a wonderful book called Getting Green Done. It's written by Auden Schendler, who's the Vice President for Sustainability at the Aspen Ski Company. And it's all about your problem. It's all about why it's really hard to get people to change, even when it's in their financial self-interest to do that, even when they can get a return on investment in 3 years. And I think one of the important lessons for me from that book is that we sometimes think if we just put the facts in front of people, the scientific facts, the economic facts, the business bottom line, that people are rational, and of course they will do what's in their rational self-interest, which is of course what in theory they're supposed to do. And yet we have enormous evidence that that's not the case. So why is it not the case? Well, because of inertia, because of corporate culture, because of ideology, because of value, because of associations that people have about what it means to be green. So to me, as a historian, as a person who's interested in culture, it's one of the reasons why it isn't enough just to look at the numbers and the facts. You do have to understand history, culture, language, all of those things. But anyway, Getting Green Done, it's a great book. You'll love it, and you'll learn a lot from it.
Yeah. And I would just add to that how the brain works, because that's one of the reasons we don't want to make changes.
Very quickly, this is not going to help your immediate problem, but when we were addressing smoking in this country, the children got the message that smoking was bad. And I can remember my 8-year-old son taking his mother's cigarettes and flushing them down the toilet every day. It made her so mad. We've got to get to the young people in this country. We've got to get to them. I tell science groups all the time, take a day, call the local school, go in and tell them you want to talk to the class about science. Do you think the science teachers in most public schools are qualified? No. They need somebody to come in and inspire these kids. That's the way you get young scientists.
Yeah.
And I think we need to look at the young people and give them the message that these are the kinds of things that ought to work for this country in the future, if only they will get engaged.
We're going to go over here.
This is a question for Mr. Porter and Dr. Restes. You both said that we need to talk. I'm a scientist. We need to talk to people. You said we don't talk enough. You pointed out that scientists have not been talking as much. I try talking. I go into schools. Nobody listens. The media is controlled by large corporations that have a very vested interest in not hearing the message. I don't think it has to do with us not wanting to talk. I think that we are not the media has taken over so that we cannot get our message across. So that, I hope this Center for Science and Democracy thinks about that, because all what you're saying, talk to the young people, it doesn't do any good. Talk to this and that, it doesn't do any good. Somehow these voices have to be out there, and there are people who control that who don't want it to be heard.
Well, yeah, I have to, as a journalist, can answer that question. LA Times no longer has science writers at all. They don't even have a health section at all. New York Times barely has a science section. Most of it's health, wellness, whatever that means, stuff. Anyway, the old ways, the old media approaches to science journalism, they just aren't there any longer. It doesn't mean that people aren't inventing new good ways. And I actually do take some comfort in Colbert and Stewart, and also the work of some of my students who are using storytelling skills to get to the heart of something, really get to the truth, and find ways of conveying it that are going to appeal to people who are walking around basically getting their news on their phones. Because this is where people are getting news. They don't, or their iPads, maybe.
Well, can I respond then? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I hear you. Well, I have a couple of things to say about that. I'm not sure what school you went to, but that's not my experience. My experience is that actually a lot of people are really interested. Polls show that young people do get this issue, so I don't think it's true to say that it's hopeless. Mass media, yeah, there's certainly problems there, but I can just tell you about my experience here at this institution. One of my colleagues once said to me, oh yeah, I tried once to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times. They didn't take it. And that's
End
it.
of that.
I was like, oh, and so that's how you do your science? Like you tried once to get an NSF grant and you didn't get it, so that was the end? No, I mean, it's like anything in life. You can't necessarily expect to always get it right the first time, and you also can't write for the New York Times the same way you write for the Journal of Geophysical Research. And all these things take time, and they're hard, and there isn't always institutional support. But that's why I think this is so important what we're doing here. Institutional support is huge. Moral support is huge, right? So we need to help each other learn how to do this. We need to help each other learn how to do it effectively. We need to have forward to support scientists who want to do it, to help them see what kinds of things have worked in the past and what kinds of things don't happen. And institutionally, Casey, you raised the issue of what happens to scientists who stick their neck out and get attacked. Well, I mean, we know it's really shocking to scientists when that happens. Most of us are not at all prepared for that. But knowing your institution is behind you, knowing, I mean, for me, it was hugely important that this institution backed me up, that my chair, my dean, the head of Scripps, I mean, people here, knowing that people here were behind you, it's hugely important. So there are things we can do to help support each other to make us supported in doing this work and effective in doing it.
Let's see, you made one knock on this heavy door and it didn't open and you gave up? No? Many, many knocks.
And what it is, you knock, and I go to schools, I go and I talk to 100 kids, I do it many, many times. Those kids get it. They're a tiny fraction. They don't matter. They're just a drop.
Sure there are, but if you were replicated, if every scientist went to the schools and multiple times, it would make a difference.
Now I can only talk one by one by one. I can't get the megaphone in public media. The case can't be made.
Well, yeah, we'll talk about that. Other people can. There are various ways to do it. But do you want to be Neil deGrasse Tyson? I mean, that's a whole other way of going. I'm going to, just to mix things up a little here, take another webcast. Is that okay? Question. Because I know it's going to come up, or it always does in one way or another.
How do we know it's not natural variability?
And how do you know what it is? You do. How could Professor Baltimore's organized honesty coexist with the organized truth of religion?
Oh.
Yeah, this may be a very short answer.
I hope I don't have to answer that.
Well, it's directed at you.
All right, maybe not.
You know, I mean, just between you and me,
And everybody on the web?
and everybody on the web, no, it's no secret. I mean, I consider religion antithetical to science, and because it's faith-based, and you can't do science with faith. It's fine for people to have faith, and it's fine for people to be religious. That's their own decision. But it shouldn't mix with science.
Yeah.
And when it does, we get into trouble.
Yeah. Look,
And the issues about stem cells, for instance, are fundamentally that issue.
Are we allowed to fight? Is that okay? Like,
Sure.
This
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't quite agree with that, because we know from the history of science there have been many, many scientists who were people of faith, and we know that many of them were actually inspired by their faith to want to better understand the natural world. So I don't think it's true or helpful to say that they're antithetical. I think they're different. I think they're based on different practices, different strategies. They address different kinds of things. They answer different kinds of questions. But I think in a way we do a disservice to the community when we say it's antithetical, because in a way we're reinforcing the idea that then there's this kind of inseparable divide. And let me just finish. And that if you're a person of faith, that there's somehow a problem with science for you. And I don't think that that's true, and I don't think that's a message that we want to really send people.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
They're just different
I said,
statements.
for me, it's antithetical because I'm not a, quote, person of faith. So I'm consistent through my whole life. But Francis Collins, who's running the National Institutes of Health, is a born-again Christian and has wrote a whole book about it.
Right.
And that doesn't stop him from doing when he was doing science, I mean, now he's sort of administering science, but didn't stop him from doing very important science and making discoveries that really move things forward. So I don't think there's any contradiction between being a person of faith and doing science. That's a different question.
So where's the antithesis then, in your view?
The antithesis is when you apply the faith to science.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what you're saying. So in terms of
right.
judging claims.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, then I agree.
Okay.
So that's good. We clarified it.
Good. I'm glad you clarified that. Right, okay, I thought the idea was that everybody who spoke was supposed to have a mic. It's hard for me to see. Oh, okay, I wasn't aware of that. Thank you. So please use the mic.
I think we have a question right here.
Oh, okay.
To address the point or the question that the gentleman raised earlier about where's the punch, I'm curious what people think about the concept of creating a rating system for legislators where they would be judged not in a partisan fashion, but on the basis in which their votes conform to proven science, regardless of one way or another.
That exists, doesn't it? Yeah. Doesn't that exist in some
That's
way?
done
Yeah.
by many groups already.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think UCS has it, but a lot of groups have it on different aspects of science.
Well, I guess that's my point, is that the point being that there are environmental groups who do votes based on environmental, but to the extent that arguably this is perhaps has the opportunity to be viewed as the most nonpartisan of these groups, a pure vote based on or ratings based on conformance with proven science without partisan positioning might be something of interest. Just to say.
You know the difficulty is that there isn't a lot of votes on science in Congress. There isn't a lot of discussion of science in the media, as we've said. There isn't a lot of, there's a group that's been trying to get a science debate among the presidential candidates that did it last time. Got nowhere. We aren't getting it this time either, I don't think. There's never a question on science offered in the presidential debates that I'm aware of, maybe one. It's just not there. And we've got to get it there.
But can I add maybe a little nuance to this?
Sure.
I mean, I would not personally want to be associated with the claim that what this forum is advocating is that legislatures have to vote in accordance with proven science. I think that would be a misstatement, at least of my personal view. I mean, there are many issues that involve science that also involve a lot of other things. And there might be cases where the scientific evidence suggests that something, is the case, but we might argue for political, ethical, cultural, economic, or other reasons that, we might just not want to do that. And that's legitimate in a democracy, I think. I think what I think we're arguing here, and other people may view it differently, is that we want good information to be part of the discussion. Accurate, fairly articulated, properly communicated, good scientific information. And we want that information to be part of the political discussion. And we're not saying that science is a trump card. We're not saying that you always have to do what science tells you to do, because that's not actually very democratic sounding, right? But it's that good information, accurately communicated, is a key part of a functioning democracy. And Lou's nodding, so I think I said that right. Good. Thanks.
So we have time for one more question, probably from the audience. If there's somebody who's been dying, had their hand up for a long time.
Lots of people dying.
We're all dying.
Maybe
Okay,
one.
I think we have one back here.
Get them a golden. No,
Yeah.
you always ask good questions.
First, I want to thank you for establishing this new center. I wrote it out because I just don't want to say the wrong thing, and I'm kind of nervous in this audience. These are very noble goals, working against the politicization of science. And David, as you quote, only in an undemocratic regime can you have anti-science. And I'm not going to disagree with that. And there are reasons why scientists don't speak up even against a propensity of evidence. However, I want to ask how you explain not just the partisan, but the bipartisan support for continuing the lack of evidence-based science used to perform such a vital role in government decision-making in regards to scientific facts, in particular with these 4 points. One of them, the free fall of World Trade Tower number 7, verifiable in high school physics, a tower not struck by a plane that crushed 82 structural feet with no explanation from NIST. Temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. EPA recorded that. NIST says fueled by office furnishings, not possible. Number 3, NIST's overt lack of transparency, calling secret computer simulations of the free fall explained only by what NIST calls one beam that failed. Let me just finish my question, then I'll just ask you what your response is.
Yeah.
And number 4, evidence of nanothermite in peer-reviewed articles that NIST says is outside their scope, and they do not intend to investigate.
Yeah.
How will you help facilitate the depolitization of these issues so that at least the science can be looked at, regardless of the outcome, just the science that's being unraveled.
This is, yeah, I'm sorry. Thanks. We're out of time. And I think that's a little bit out of scope unless somebody wants to take it on of what we're talking about here. And I think that Peter wants to.
About the investigation. I'm not asking about an answer.
I don't know anything about it.
Lucky you.
Well, first, let me say I don't know anything about the specifics of that issue, but and so I'm not qualified to answer it, and so I won't try. But I would say that in any kind of democratic process, including the kind of town hall public dialogue that we're having here today, it's important that all voices have an opportunity to be expressed, that they not be suppressed. And so I appreciate you putting your ideas forward, and the fact that I can't answer them may I finish, please? Because this is my turn to put my voice forward. I have no basis for making a judgment on your on either your facts or your opinions, and I'm assuming that no one else on the panel does either. So I'm now going to turn to some closing remarks. I want to thank Casey and the panelists for their vigorous engagement and dialogue. And I realize that I'm standing between all of us, and a reception, so I'm going to make my comments succinct. I do want to speak in a moment to some of the points that have been raised through this last dialogue, but I want to start by saying that I'm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at UCS, at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And Cambridge and UCS are, for me, tremendous places from which to work on invigorating the role of science in our public discourse and our public policies. But my own professional passions for science and the public good were forged here at UCSD. I grew up outside of Los Angeles. In September 1974, I came to UCSD as a freshman in Revelle College. I was really inspired by Roger Revelle's and Revelle College's vision and energetic commitment to creating a community of broadly trained young scientists, scholars. And I was enabled to pursue my passions by the state of California's vision at the time, an energetic commitment to affordable public higher education. In 1974 and 75, we paid $636 a year in tuition. Such a deal. My freshman or sophomore year, I was privileged to join a series of talks, small group discussions on science and policy under the rubric of Frontiers of Science that Roger Revelle led. I was hooked, and it's really good to come home and come full circle. So where do we go from here with the Center for Science and Democracy? You've heard from Kevin Knobloch about the overall design of the center, and from Jim McCarthy and Lou Branscombe about our centerpiece, the Branscombe Science and Democracy Forums. Jim mentioned our first experiments with the forum model this past year, bringing, for example, experts and practitioners across disciplines together to solve problems and create public dialogue to ensure that independent science informs decisions at the FDA, and to improve public understanding of the risks and choices we face in confronting climate change. And I mentioned just a few minutes ago that we're actually the next 2 days holding a third test driving of this forum concept, in part by looking at the opportunities to learn from the lessons of the history of tobacco control and how we can apply them to controlling climate change. In the months ahead, we'll launch our first formal Science and Democracy forums. One, for example, will focus on tackling the social media's impact on science communication, something we really haven't talked about much here, on the public's ability to distinguish fact from misinformation. We'll bring together journalists, social media experts, social scientists, and others, and most importantly, young scientists and a public dialogue to explore what tools we can develop and apply in a vigorous way to create and foster greater accountability for communicating science in the digital world. No small challenge. So these forums, though, are just part of the Center for Science and Democracy's energetic agenda. We've already begun mobilizing the Union of Concerned Scientists, almost 20,000 strong network of scientists to promote their more energetic dialogue between themselves as experts and the broader public community, and we'll be expanding upon that. And we'll be reaching out to more vigorously engage business leaders, faith leaders, and political leaders across the ideological spectrum to reject misinformation and speak from their perspectives on the values of science in our democracy. Scientists' voices alone, it will not be enough. I want to just say a few words about the science and advocacy dialogue that was raised here. It's really important. Now, UCS really works at that kind of uneasy space between science and advocacy, and there's a creative tension between being effective as a scientist and being effective as an advocate, and I actually quite love that tension. It's really why I love working at UCS. And I just want to say a couple things about it, that Mario Molina, for example, who, as Naomi mentioned, is here at Scripps actually on the board of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and with Sherry Rowland was a leader in the discovery of the role of chlorofluorocarbons in the ozone problem, said that, you know, if he and Sherry hadn't spoken out, who would? And that he said, it's just important as a scientist that when we speak out to advocate, we're really clear to distinguish what we know as scientists and our values, right? And I think it's really important that we all do that, that as scientists we bring particular expertise, but we also bring values, and it's important not to conflate them. But it's also important not to deny them. As scientists, when you get a PhD, you don't revoke your citizenship. And scientists have a responsibility, I would argue an obligation, to engage in the public dialogue, but to be very clear about what we know as experts and what we believe as citizens. We're all citizens and constituents, and we have a right and an opportunity to bring our voices to bear, and that's really what UCS and the center is all about. So I want to invite you to join us in the co-creation of the work of the center. We're clearly at an early stage. Much of the canvas is still to be painted, and your input and vigorous collaboration is both welcome and needed. So come to our website, ucsusa.org. You'll see information on the Center for Science and Democracy and other activities of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and there'll be information over time on how you can engage. Please come introduce yourself to me or other UCS colleagues and staff here at the reception this afternoon. And now I simply want to invite you to join us in continuing today's dialogue at the reception. So thank you very much.